And the spark for this whole deep dive is this tweet. I don't know if you saw this one. It was like, nature doesn't care about your beliefs. Which, at first glance, it's like, yeah, okay, sure. But then, the more you think about it,
Like, well, hold on a second. Is that really true? Is it that straightforward?
right. And that's exactly what happened on Twitter. It blew up.
Oh, yeah. And it's one of those that just gets people going because it digs into something so deep. How do we fit into this whole universe thing?
For real. And this thread goes right to the heart of it. It starts with these two users, at Mike Humor and at Light of Reflection, who are coming at it from like totally opposite ends.
Oh, yeah, I remember that thread. It was pretty intense.
Right. So you've got it, Mike Humor saying nature is like this indifferent force. It just is. And then you've got it, Light of Reflection saying, no, no, no. Nature's showing us something. There are inherent truths.
It's that classic debate, right? Is there meaning built into the universe, or are we just making it up as we go along?
Yeah. Like, is there something out there, or are we just, a bunch of random atoms bumping around?
And at Light of Reflection, they brought up this really interesting point using a typhoon as an analogy. They were saying even if you don't usually believe in a higher power, in a moment like that, facing this immense, powerful storm,
You're kind of going to be like, hello? Anyone up there?
right, it's that instinct to reach out to hope for something beyond ourselves.
Totally. Like when those waves are crashing down and the wind is howling, maybe those beliefs start to feel a little less firm, right?
Yeah, and some people push back saying, hey, survival in a typhoon comes down to preparation. Having the right gear, knowing what to do.
Right. Like being practical. And luck, let's not forget luck.
Absolutely, a huge dose of luck. But, at Light of Reflection kept coming back to this idea that even when we think we're in control, nature has a way of reminding us that we're not. And they brought in some pretty powerful stuff to support that.
They did. I mean, they even quoted verses from the Quran, which I thought was really interesting. There's this one, 29.65. It's like, and when they embark on a ship, they supplicate Allah, sincere to him in religion. But when he delivers them to the land, they associate others with him.
Wow, that really gets to the heart of it, doesn't it? That human tendency to call out for help when we're in trouble, but then maybe forget when things are going well.
Exactly. It's like we remember there might be something bigger than us when we're facing those forces, like in that typhoon analogy. But then, life goes back to normal and we forget.
And it makes you think about how different cultures view nature, right? In some traditions, nature is sacred. It's not just something out there, it's part of something much bigger, something spiritual.
That's a great point. It makes me wonder, is this whole seeking a higher power in crisis thing a universal human response? Or is it, like you said, shaped by where we come from, our cultural background?
It's a really good question. I mean, on one hand, you've got the psychological aspect of it. Maybe it's just our brains trying to cope with fear, with the unknown.
Right, like a defense mechanism, right?
Exactly. But then you also have the cultural and even evolutionary side of things. For centuries, humans have been trying to make sense of the natural world, and religion and spirituality often play a big role in that.
It's like we're trying to find our place in the cosmos, figure out where we fit in. And speaking of finding your place, the thread takes this crazy turn with this super personal story.
Oh, yeah. You talking about the Howard Storm story?
Yeah, have you heard about this? I hadn't before I read this thread.
I have. It's a pretty powerful one.
Let's say, so Howard Storm, he was this atheist art professor, like hardcore atheist.
Yeah, really outspoken about it, from what I understand.
Exactly. And then he has this near-death experience.
During a medical emergency, right?
Right. And, he's literally staring death in the face. And he finds himself praying, like begging for help.
Wow. That's quite a shift.
It's a total 180. And this experience was so intense, so profound for him, that it totally changed his entire worldview.
He became a believer, right?
Not just a believer, he became a minister. I
Wow.
know, right? Like, talk about a life-altering experience. And I can totally see why this story was such a big deal in that thread. It brings up so many questions.
Yeah, like on one hand, it's such a compelling story, but on the other, you have to wonder, could this just be a psychological response to trauma? Like your brain trying to make sense of this incredibly intense experience?
Right, like a coping mechanism for dealing with the fear of death.
Exactly. And, there's a whole field of research on near-death experiences, and there are a lot of different interpretations.
Yeah, some people see them as proof of an afterlife, while others explain them as like these neurological things happening in the brain when you're close to death.
And it's hard to say for sure who's right. We just don't have all the answers yet.
Okay, so let's take a step back. We started with this tweet, nature doesn't care about your beliefs. Then we got this debate about whether nature's revealing something deeper, some inherent truth. Then we've got these verses from the Quran suggesting that even non-believers might turn to a higher power when things get rough. And then, bam, the Howard Storm story. A total mind bender.
It is a lot to process.
So where do we even go from here? What's the takeaway?
I think at its core, this whole discussion is about the human need to grapple with the immensity of nature, to try and understand these forces that are so much bigger than us.
And we're searching for explanations, for meaning, for comfort.
Yeah, for something to hold on to. And sometimes that leads us to this idea of a higher power, something beyond ourselves.
And sometimes just facing the sheer power of nature, like in a typhoon or a near-death experience, can shake us to our core.
It can challenge everything we thought we knew. It forces us to confront our own mortality. And in those moments, we might find ourselves seeking something, anything, to make sense of it all.
Make you think.
It really does. And that brings me to the question I want to leave you with today. If we as humans have this deep-seated instinct to seek a higher power in moments of crisis, no matter what we believed before, what does that tell us about who we are, about our place in this crazy, awesome, often terrifying universe?
Deep stuff. Does nature, care about what we believe? What if you're caught in a typhoon? Are your prayers going to make a difference? Or is nature just going to do its thing regardless?
I mean, that's a pretty heavy question right there.
It is, and that's exactly what we're diving into today.
Buckle up.
We're calling this deep dive Nature Beliefs and the Instinct to Pray.
Ooh, catchy.
And we've got some pretty fiery viewpoints to unpack.
Fire away.
So this whole thing started with a user named Matemuck on, the site. They basically said, look, nature doesn't give a hoot about what you believe.
Straight to the point.
Yeah, and they used this example of a typhoon hitting the China Sea.
All right. Okay.
Their point was the typhoon doesn't discriminate. It's going to wreak havoc whether you're praying or not.
So basically, they're coming from a perspective where the universe is like a giant machine. Everything runs on these fixed laws of physics. There's no room for a higher power to, step in and change things because of your beliefs.
Makes sense, I guess. But then we've got it light of reflection jumping into the ring with a counter-argument.
No, this is where it gets good.
Right. They come in saying, hold up, I'm not interested in beliefs either.
Okay. Interesting.
I care about logical facts embedded in nature.
Logical facts embedded in nature.
Yeah, pretty deep, right? And then they hit us with this analogy.
Shit, man.
They said, just because a blind man doesn't acknowledge the sun
Right.
doesn't mean the sun isn't there. It's like they're saying atheists are kind of blind to a bigger truth.
Whoa, that's a pretty bold statement.
It is, right?
Right.
So how do they tie this back to the whole typhoon thing?
Well, they use that Muck's own argument against them.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah, they basically say, imagine you're on a ship in the middle of that typhoon, right? Waves crashing all around, you might just start praying.
Even if you're a diehard atheist.
Exactly. It's like that saying there are no atheists in foxholes.
So at Light of Reflection saying this instinct to pray, even when we claim not to believe it, points to something deeper.
Like a built-in recognition of a higher power that we can't ignore even if we try.
And they bring in some verses from the Quran to support this 29.65 and 27.62. What do those verses say?
Essentially, they say that when people are in deep trouble, like really facing death, they instinctively cry out to a higher power for help.
Interesting. So it's not just about a specific religion. It's like a human thing.
Exactly. At Light of Reflection is arguing that this isn't just a Muslim thing or a Christian thing. It's a universal human experience that points to this innate awareness of the divine.
It's like we're wired for it in a way.
Maybe. And to drive this point home, they share a story about this guy named Howard Storm.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of him.
So he was an art professor, a staunch atheist, no belief in God whatsoever. But then in 1985, he's in Paris. He has this perforated stomach.
Ouch.
Yeah, he's in excruciating pain, like near-death kind of pain. And guess what happens?
He starts...
He finds himself crying out to God for help despite his atheism. This experience totally changed his life. He became a Christian minister later on.
Wow, talk about a plot twist.
Yeah.
So does this story, blow it Muck's argument out of the water?
Well, it definitely complicates things. It makes you think about whether this instinct to pray is just our brains freaking out in a crisis or if it's a sign of something more,
A connection to something beyond ourselves.
Right, a glimpse behind the curtain of the material world.
So where do we land on this whole debate?
Well, on one hand, we've got this idea that nature operates on autopilot, right? Our beliefs don't change the laws of physics. But on the other hand, we've got this powerful instinct that seems to be ingrained in us, this urge to reach out to something bigger than ourselves when we're facing the unknown.
It's almost like we're hardwired to hope.
Yeah, and where you fall on the spectrum ultimately comes down to your own personal beliefs and experiences.
It's a personal journey for sure. It's funny. I was thinking while we were talking, I've caught myself saying little prayers during bumpy flights.
Oh, yeah, me too.
Yeah. And I wouldn't even call myself religious. It's like this primal instinct kicks in when I feel like things are out of my control.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Even those of us who don't consciously follow a religion, we still seem to reach for something beyond ourselves in those moments of vulnerability.
Maybe there's a reason for that.
Perhaps it's a hint that there's more to the universe than meets the eye, that our connection to something bigger than ourselves runs deeper than we realize.
I like that. So to wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with a question to ponder.
All right, shoot.
What do you reach for when you're feeling vulnerable?
Good way.
Does your experience tell you that the world is just a bunch of atoms and energy, or do you feel like there might be something more out there?
The answer to that question might just be the key to unlocking a deeper understanding of your place in the universe.
And who knows, maybe it'll lead you to your own personal deep dive into the mysteries of existence.
Picking up right where we left off.
Yeah, you know, that big question, does nature care at all about what we believe?
Right.
Like if we pray, does it actually matter, or are we just,
talking to ourselves, basically.
exactly, just talking to the void?
Get in the void.
So in part one, we saw some really interesting arguments.
We did.
Like the idea that maybe humans are just naturally wired for faith. But then others were saying, well, hold on, maybe it's just a way of coping
Right.
with a world that feels chaotic and unpredictable.
Makes sense.
So in part two, things get a little bit more intense.
Oh, yeah.
We have this new person who jumps into the conversation.
Okay.
They call themselves at Muck,
Oh,
and they come out swinging with a pretty bold statement.
really?
They say, and I'm quoting here, nature doesn't care. Prayer is just human vanity. The typhoon doesn't care who you call out to.
Wow. Okay, so straight to the point.
Right.
No messing around.
It's like a slap in the face.
I mean, it's definitely a very clear, skeptical viewpoint, right?
Yeah.
Nature just is. It doesn't care about our beliefs or our hopes.
Or our prayers.
Or our prayers.
It's just this in a different force.
And so from that perspective, if you can't see a direct link between prayer and something happening in the world,
Like the typhoon changing direction.
exactly, then it starts to look like we're just fooling ourselves.
I have to admit, I laughed out loud when I read the typhoon part.
Yeah.
It's kind of dark, but also,
Very vivid imagery.
yeah, definitely sticks with you.
For sure.
Okay, so then we have at Light of Reflection, who steps in and offers this amazing response.
Okay.
It's not just a disagreement. It's like a total reframing of the whole argument.
Oh, interesting.
So they start by saying, okay, if we're going to talk about indifference, let's be real. Nature doesn't care about science either.
That's a good point.
Right. It doesn't care about government.
Or atheism.
Exactly. It's like a Light of Reflection is saying, hey, if you're going to use that nature doesn't care argument to dismiss prayer, then you got to apply it consistently.
Right across the board.
Exactly. You can't pick and choose.
Exactly.
So then they bring up these super interesting examples.
Okay, I'm curious.
Like radio waves
Okay.
and love.
Okay.
We can't see those things directly.
Right.
We can't measure them with like a ruler or a microscope.
You can't put them under a microscope, no.
But we all agree that they're real and that they have a powerful impact on our lives.
Absolutely.
So what Light of Reflection is doing is they're using these examples to say, hey, maybe prayer works on a similar level.
I see. So it might not be something that we can easily control or even fully understand.
Right.
But that it doesn't mean it's not a real force.
Exactly.
That's fascinating.
And I think it's such a clever way to challenge how we think about proof.
Yeah, because we often think about proof as something that's very scientific.
Yeah.
Very measurable.
I like to add that data.
Right. But at Light of Reflection is reminding us that there are other ways of knowing. Through intuition, through personal experience.
And faith.
And faith, yes.
And those can give us different perspectives, different insights.
Absolutely.
So then at Light of Reflection throws out this question that really made me stop and think.
What's that?
They ask, why is it that even people who don't believe in God, they still find themselves crying out for help when they're in those moments of real desperation?
Right, like a gut reaction almost.
Exactly.
In times of crisis.
Is it just a reflex?
Yeah.
Or could it be a sign of something deeper?
Yeah, like a yearning for connection.
Yeah, with something beyond ourselves.
With something bigger.
And that question really gets to those psychological and even spiritual aspects of being human.
It does. It makes you think about what it means to be human in the face of something so much greater than ourselves.
Exactly.
Wow.
Okay, so then they make this other point about consciousness. They argue that in order to even see something as being indifferent, You first have to have the capacity to care yourself.
That's deep.
Right.
Because you have to understand what it means to care in order to recognize the absence of it.
Exactly.
So what does that say about us then?
Right.
As humans?
What does it say about our own capacity for caring?
And does it hint at the possibility of a consciousness beyond our own?
That also cares.
That also care, yes.
It's mind-blowing.
It is. It really pushes the boundaries of how we think about the world.
It does. And then to wrap it all up, at Light of Reflection, leaves us with this incredibly powerful statement.
I'm listening.
They say, nature may not care, but the one who created it does.
Wow.
So to bring you back to that core debate.
Right, faith versus skepticism.
Exactly. And they're suggesting that there's a creator out there who's not bound by the limitations of nature.
Right.
And who might actually be involved in what happens to us.
Intervening in human affairs.
In ways that we might not always be able to grasp.
In ways we can't fully comprehend.
So that brings us to the end of this deep dive.
And where do we go from here?
Well, at Light of Reflection ends with a challenge.
Okay.
And I want to pass that challenge on to you.
Right.
They ask, imagine you're in a moment of real danger.
Okay.
Would you rely on science or chance? Or would you turn to something? Something beyond human understanding?
That's a powerful question.
It is, and there's no right or wrong answer.
Right, it's not about that.
It's about making you think about your own beliefs.
Your own values.
What do you truly believe in?
What do you put your faith in at the end of the day?
And for me, that's the most incredible part of this whole conversation.
I agree.
It's not about finding all the answers.
It's not about being right or wrong.
It's about being open to the mystery.
To the complexity of existence.
To the fact that there might be forces at work.
That we're only just starting to understand.
That we might never fully understand.
That's the beauty of it.
Surely is.
Keeps us curious, keeps us exploring, keeps us learning.
So keep diving deep, everyone.
Keep questioning.
This conversation is just the beginning.
The beginning of a much larger journey.
Exactly. I gotta say, the waters are still pretty murky from last time.
Yeah, deep dives can get like that. Sometimes you come up with more questions than answers.
Totally. But the good thing is, we get to grapple with some pretty thought-provoking stuff along the way. And today, we've got this exchange between at Muck and at Light of Reflection that really got me thinking.
Oh, yeah. What'd they have to say?
Well, at Muck lays out some pretty standard arguments against belief, the kind of stuff you hear a lot. But then at Light of Reflection comes back with some pretty sharp, even funny rebuttals.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Humor is always a good sign. So set the stage for us. What's the first point of contention?
Well, at Muck, it kicks things off by saying, prayer is nothing more than a desperate yelp. Like, a dog howling at the moon when it's feeling lost and alone.
That's a pretty bleak take, isn't it? Reducing this complex human behavior to just a primal cry for help.
Right. I mean, sure, sometimes people pray when they're desperate. But there's got to be more to it than that, right?
I think so. At Light of Reflection makes a good point about how humans across history and cultures have always turned to something bigger than themselves. I mean, we've built entire religions, moral codes, you name it, around this impulse to connect with the unseen.
Yeah, and they even talk about how people have attributed scientific breakthroughs to some kind of divine inspiration. I mean, it's not just about crying out in distress. There's this whole other side of prayer that's about awe, gratitude, searching for meaning.
Exactly. And it's not like dogs are building cathedrals or writing symphonies, right?
Yeah.
There's something uniquely human about this drive to connect with something beyond the material world.
Totally. So if prayer is just a meaningless yelp, why this universal instinct to reach out to something bigger than ourselves?
It really makes you wonder, is it all just cultural programming like at Muck suggests? Or is there something more innate, something woven into the fabric of our being?
Because that's at Muck's next argument. They say, belief is basically like being assigned a role in a play. You're born into a certain culture, handed your lines, and expected to perform accordingly. No free will, just cultural conditioning.
The old cultural backdrop argument. It's a popular one. But you know what at Light of Reflection points out?
What's that?
They say, well, doesn't that same logic apply to skepticism and atheism? I mean, aren't those also products of a particular cultural context?
Whoa, yeah, they're basically saying you can't say faith is just blind adherence to cultural norms while claiming skepticism is somehow objective. That's a pretty clever point.
Right. It's like saying only religious people are influenced by their upbringing, while skeptics are somehow immune.
And then at Light of Reflection takes it a step further. They say, look, nature itself doesn't seem to care about our beliefs, whether we're praying to Allah, Yahweh, or conducting scientific experiments. The universe just keeps on spinning.
That's a really interesting observation. It kind of shifts the focus away from proving or disproving God's existence and onto the question of why humans are so obsessed with finding meaning and purpose, regardless of their beliefs.
Yeah, like if it all boils down to just random chance,
Yeah.
why are we so driven to find order and purpose in a seemingly indifferent universe?
Right. It's like we're hardwired to seek something beyond the material, even if we can't quite explain it. And this brings us to, at Light of Reflection's homeowner example.
Oh yeah, this one's a good one.
So imagine a massive fire tearing through a neighborhood. One homeowner, fleeing for their life, cries out, "God, save this house!" And miraculously, it's the only one left standing.
Okay, so what are we supposed to make of that? Pure luck, divine intervention.
Exactly. It's like at Light of Reflection is saying, even if you're a hardcore skeptic, can you honestly say you wouldn't feel a flicker of, I don't know, something if you were in that homeowner's shoes?
That's a really powerful image. It makes you wonder, in those moments of extreme desperation, do even the most rational among us reach for something beyond the tangible?
I think it speaks to a deeper truth about human nature. We're not just rational beings, we're also emotional, spiritual creatures who crave connection and meaning. And sometimes that means acknowledging the possibility of something bigger than ourselves.
So where does this leave us? Is faith just a product of our environment, or is it something more profound?
Maybe it's both. Maybe it's this complex interplay between our cultural conditioning and a deeper yearning for something beyond the physical realm.
And maybe that very tension is what makes faith so compelling.
I think at Light of Reflection would agree. They're not trying to shove any particular belief system down anyone's throat. They're simply pointing out the limitations of a purely materialistic worldview and inviting us to consider other possibilities.
It's like they're saying, hey, the universe might be indifferent, but that doesn't mean we have to be. We can still choose to seek connection, meaning, and maybe even a little bit of hope.
And who knows, maybe that very search is what makes us human.
That's a pretty good note to end on, don't you think?
I think so. It leaves us with more to ponder, more to explore, and isn't that what a good deep dive is all about?
Absolutely. In the China Sea,
Okay.
does praying actually improve your chances?
Like, what are the odds?
Yeah, like realistically,
Yeah.
is it going to do anything for you?
That's a big question.
So how does At Light of Reflection handle that kind of direct challenge?
Oh,
I mean, can faith really, like, stand up to a hurricane?
well, At Light of Reflection actually doesn't flinch at all.
Really?
Yeah, they point out that At Muk is kind of approaching prayer. Like it's this, like a cosmic vending machine.
Oh, I like that.
You know, like put in your prayer and you'll get your desired outcome.
Right, right.
So they're arguing that prayer isn't about like forcing the universe to like bend to your will.
Oh, okay.
It's more about just recognizing that there is this higher power and accepting its plan.
So it's more about kind of like the internal shift
Yeah.
than necessarily dictating what happens outside of you.
Exactly. Exactly. And they use this really interesting analogy.
Okay.
They say like, think about like courage in battle or hope when you're facing a crisis. Like
Yeah.
these things, they don't magically make you invincible, but they can dramatically change how you cope
I like that.
with this situation.
It's not so much, did my prayer work? It's more like, how did prayer work on me?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But then that kind of raises another question, right? If it's not about getting specific results, what are the possible outcomes according to At Light of Reflection? Like, what are they saying can happen when you pray?
So they actually outline two main outcomes.
Okay.
And this is where I think it gets a little bit more complex.
All right. I'm intrigued.
So the first outcome is survival, right? And it's presented as like a second chance,
Okay.
like a gift from the higher power, you know.
Like you were spared.
Yeah, and maybe your connection with that power through prayer was part of why,
Okay. Yeah, I can see that.
you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So things don't always go that smoothly, right?
Mhm.
So what about the other outcome? What's the flip side of that?
The second outcome that they present is death.
Okay.
But here's the thing.
Oh.
They frame it as a return to the creator. You know, they emphasize that death is going to come for everybody eventually.
Right.
But for those who prayed and acknowledged God in their lives, they will be remembered by him on the day of judgment.
So it's kind of like heads I win, tails I still win.
You could look at it that way, yeah.
But is that really like, is that really a win-win? Or is it kind of sidestepping the question of like,
Right.
did prayer actually get you what you wanted in this earthly realm?
It's definitely something to think about, and that's where At Light of Reflection draws a contrast with what they see as the atheist viewpoint.
Okay, so what's that contrast? What do they say about atheists?
Okay, so from At Light of Reflection's perspective, the atheist sees everything as essentially random.
Okay.
So survival is just a roll of the dice,
Mm-hmm.
and death is just lights out.
The end.
That's it.
Okay.
There's no bigger meaning, no grand plan, just this random existence that ultimately ends in nothing.
So they're saying that regardless of the outcome, prayer at least provides that sense of purpose
Yeah, and connection.
that maybe atheism lacks.
Exactly.
Like, it's not just what happens to you, it's how you frame your entire existence.
Exactly, and they take it a step further.
Oh, here we go.
They say one of these viewpoints has to be true. Either we are all judged in the afterlife, or none of us are.
Okay.
There's no in-between, no separate set of rules.
Whoa, that's a bold statement.
It is.
Like, you can't cherry pick the parts of reality you like.
Nope.
So how does that monk respond to that?
Well, At Light of Reflection throws down the gauntlet.
Oh.
They challenge Muck to disprove God's existence.
Okay.
Or somehow escape death to prove their point.
Oh my goodness.
It's provocative.
That's intense. Like, can you even prove or disprove something as big as, like, God or the afterlife?
Yeah.
Are we getting into some deep philosophical territory here?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a question people have been debating for centuries.
Right.
And it raises questions about how much can we actually know for sure, and what role does faith play when we hit the limits of human understanding.
So we've got this challenge to disprove God, and then this idea that all signs point to a creator, but it doesn't stop there.
Oh, no.
They then introduce what they call the atheist gamble.
Oh, I've heard of this.
What is that about?
So this is where I think the debate gets really, really interesting from like a psychological point of view.
Okay.
Because what At Light of Reflection is suggesting is that choosing atheism is like making this high stakes bet
Right.
with potentially eternal consequences.
Wow.
So their argument is basically like, if atheists are wrong and there is a judgment day,
Okay.
they've missed the boat.
Like, they're out.
Yeah, on this blissful afterlife. Yeah.
It's like saying, sure, you can live your life without faith, but are you willing to risk eternal damnation just to make a point?
Pretty much, yeah.
It feels a little loaded.
It does. It definitely adds this layer of emotional intensity
Right.
to the debate.
Well, this time things get even more complex as we examine how faith intersects with power dynamics and historical claims.
Yeah, I mean, and that's where, things can get really controversial.
Oh, absolutely.
Because you're dealing with, people's deeply held beliefs, and you're also dealing with, history and interpretation.
Yeah, interpretations.
And, all of these things can be very subjective.
Right. And, one comment from @muck
Mm-hmm.
really sparked my curiosity
Mhm.
because they use the conflict in Palestine as a jumping-off point to question the validity of religious claims,
Okay.
especially those rooted in ancient texts and the idea of unseen deities.
Right.
They're particularly skeptical of the Hebrew claim to Palestine based on a promise from what they call a sky god from 2,000 years ago.
Okay. Yeah, and that's a perspective we hear a lot. This idea that religious claims based on events from so long ago just shouldn't hold weight in the modern world.
Right.
And it's definitely a valid point to consider. I mean, how do we reconcile these ancient beliefs with the realities of today,
Exactly.
especially in areas that are marked by conflict and violence?
Right. Like, how much weight do those ancient promises hold,
Right.
in the face of all these present-day complexities?
Yeah, and that's where I think At Light of Reflection jumps into the conversation with a really interesting response.
Yeah.
Because instead of dismissing Muck's skepticism, outright, they use it as a springboard to explore this idea that many religions today have strayed from their original purity.
Oh, that's interesting. So they're not denying that religious beliefs can be misused or distorted,
Right.
but they're saying that there's like a deeper, more authentic core that's been kind of lost or corrupted.
Exactly. And to get to that core, to separate what they see as genuine divine guidance from human manipulation, they present this 9-step test for identifying the true path.
Okay, a 9-step test. I'm intrigued already.
It's a framework that emphasizes things like continuity from the very beginning of the religion,
Okay.
the presence of miracles and fulfilled prophecies, texts that have remained unchanged, over time, and this idea of divinely appointed leaders or custodians who ensure the correct interpretation of those texts.
Okay, wait, hold on. Divinely appointed leaders.
Yes.
Doesn't that go against the idea of individual interpretation and free will?
That's a great question, and it's one that goes right to the heart of the debate between faith and reason. you know?
Yeah.
How much room is there for individual interpretation when you're dealing with a belief system that claims to have the single divinely ordained truth?
Right, like who gets to decide what that truth is?
Exactly. And that's a tension that we're going to be exploring throughout this deep dive.
Okay, I'm ready to
Yes.
do it.
Right.
Yeah, it definitely raises some eyebrows. Like, on the one hand, you've got at Muck, arguing against this whole idea of any single true path,
Right.
especially one based on ancient claims.
Right.
And then on the other, you've got at Light of Reflection saying, well, no, there is a true path. But it hinges on this very specific set of criteria, including these divinely appointed leaders. It's fascinating.
It is. And to understand at Light of Reflection's argument a little bit better, I think we need to kind of unpack these 9 steps.
Yeah, let's break it down for us. What are the key elements of this true path test?
So they start by emphasizing continuity. They argue that a true faith should have a clear, unbroken line of transmission from its founder to the present day.
Okay, so like a chain, each link representing a generation passing down the teachings?
Exactly. No broken links, no missing pieces, in the historical puzzle.
Gotcha.
And then there's this whole question of miracles.
Okay.
At Light of Reflection believes that true prophets and divine messengers should be accompanied by events that defy natural laws.
So like supernatural proof, a divine stamp of approval.
Precisely. And they extend this idea to the sacred texts themselves.
Okay.
They argue that these texts should have remained unchanged over time, preserved in their original form.
So like a perfectly preserved time capsule containing the unadulterated Word of God.
Yes. And to add another layer, they believe that these texts should also contain prophecies that have come true,
Okay.
demonstrating a kind of foreknowledge that only a divine being could possess.
Right. So prophecies as a way of showing that there's this, divine plan in motion.
Yeah. That's the idea. And this all leads up to, I think, the most intriguing and potentially controversial aspect of their argument.
Okay.
These divinely appointed custodians.
Right. The folks who hold the keys to the kingdom, so to speak.
Exactly.
But how do they fit into all this? And how do they address at Muck's concerns about, ancient claims being used to justify present day actions?
Well, at Light of Reflection argues that these custodians are individuals specifically chosen either by the founder of the religion or, within the sacred texts themselves to interpret and safeguard the teachings.
So not just anyone can interpret the holy books.
Right.
There's a specific lineage of authority.
Exactly. And they believe that these custodians are not chosen based on worldly status or power,
Okay.
but rather through divine appointment, often marked by their exceptional knowledge and spiritual insight.
So they're like a living link to the original revelation, making sure the teachings are passed down accurately and protected from corruption. Okay, I see where they're going with this. But wouldn't that mean that the vast majority of people who follow a particular faith might actually be on the wrong track
Right.
if they're not following these specific custodians?
That's exactly the point that At Light of Reflection makes.
Wow.
They apply this 9-step test to argue that the truest path lies within a small subset of Muslims who believe in the divinely appointed custodians of the Quran,
Okay.
the progeny of Prophet Muhammad.
So they're saying that even within a major world religion like Islam, only a tiny fraction of followers are truly adhering to the true path.
It might seem paradoxical, but that's their argument, and they use this really interesting analogy of counterfeit currency to illustrate this point.
Okay.
Just because there are many fake bills circulating doesn't mean that the real currency doesn't exist. In fact, the existence of the fakes actually highlights the value and authenticity of the real thing.
So they're saying that the prevalence of all these different interpretations, even corruptions of a faith, doesn't invalidate the existence of a true path.
Exactly. And this leads to another crucial aspect of their argument, this importance of intellectual honesty and resisting worldly desires.
Okay.
They suggest that those who cling to worldly power, wealth, fame, are more likely to distort the true message for their own benefit.
That's a pretty bold statement, especially considering how often religion and power have been intertwined throughout history.
It is, and it raises the question of how we can even discern between, genuine spiritual authority and those who might be using faith for their own agendas.
Right. Are we looking at the messenger or the message?
Exactly.
Yeah, it really is. It's like we've been handed this giant jigsaw puzzle
Right.
of faith and history and human interpretation, and we're just trying to, piece it together without even knowing what the final picture is supposed to look like.
Exactly. And like you said, some of the pieces might be missing,
Right.
or they might have been, altered over time, or maybe there are even fake pieces thrown in just to confuse us.
Yeah, and we're back to that counterfeit money analogy.
Right.
So how do we be tips they offer for navigating this complex landscape of faith and truth?
Absolutely. I think one of the key takeaways from their argument is this idea that we need to be wary of those who cling to worldly power and use faith for their own gain. It's a reminder to look beyond the surface, to question motives, and to be skeptical of those who present themselves as having all the answers.
So a healthy dose of skepticism, even when it comes to religious leaders or institutions.
Exactly. And it's not about being cynical or dismissive, but about engaging critically,
Right.
asking questions like, who benefits from this interpretation?
Right.
Or what are the potential biases at play here?
That's so important, especially in today's world where, you know, information and misinformation spreads so quickly.
Right.
We need to be able to think for ourselves
Right.
and not just blindly accept what we're told.
Absolutely. And another practical tip, I think, from a light of reflection is this emphasis on seeking out sources that have remained consistent over time.
Oh, yeah.
They argue that texts or traditions that have been preserved in their original form are more likely to contain those authentic teachings.
Right. So looking for that continuity, that unbroken chain we talked about earlier. But how can we even know for sure that something has remained unchanged over centuries?
Right.
Isn't there always room for interpretation and human error?
Well, that's where the critical thinking comes in again. It's about examining the historical context,
Right.
considering different perspectives and being aware of, the potential for bias or manipulation. It's not about blindly accepting a text or a tradition as perfect, but about engaging with it thoughtfully and critically.
So it sounds like what we're really talking about is a shift from passive belief to active seeking.
Yes.
It's not about just inheriting a set of beliefs,
Yeah.
but about embarking on a journey of personal exploration and discovery. So one of the first things that David brings up is the idea of prayer.
Okay.
And they make the point that if there's no God, then, well, prayer is kind of pointless.
Seems pretty straightforward.
Right. On the surface, it sounds pretty logical. Why waste your time talking to someone who isn't there?
Right.
But a Light of Reflection comes back with this really interesting analogy.
Oh, I'm intrigued. What is it?
They say, imagine if you didn't believe in oxygen.
Okay.
Would you still breathe?
Well, I guess I'd have to, right? To stay alive.
Exactly. Breathing is essential for our survival, even if we don't consciously think about the oxygen that makes it possible.
So they're saying prayer could be the same way, even if you don't believe in a God.
Yeah, and they're pointing out that at David's argument kind of assumes the very thing it's trying to prove,
Yeah.
that God doesn't exist.
Ah, so it's a bit of circular reasoning.
Exactly. It's like saying unicorns can't grant wishes because they're not real. Well, duh.
Uh-huh.
If you start with the assumption that they don't exist, then it's not much of an argument, is it?
No, not really. So what else did David have to say?
Well, then they sort of throw out this question like, does it even matter if God exists?
Oh, I've heard that one before.
I know, right? It's almost like they're saying, let's just move on, nothing to see here.
Right.
But at Light of Reflection doesn't let them off the hook so easily.
What do they say?
They come back and say, hold on a second, the implications are huge.
Okay, yeah, I can see that.
They argue that if there's no God, then morality becomes completely subjective.
Meaning there's no right or wrong, just individual opinions.
Yeah, basically. And they go on to say that without God, there's no inherent purpose to existence either.
It's like we're just random accidents in a random universe.
Yeah, kind of bleak, isn't it?
Yeah, a little bit.
And they also point out that without God, there's no ultimate justice.
Interesting. So the good guys don't always win, and the bad guys don't always get punished.
Right. And this isn't just theoretical stuff. This has real implications for how we live our lives, how we treat each other, the choices we make.
It paints a very different picture of the world depending on whether you believe in God or not.
Absolutely. Now, things get even more interesting when David accuses anyone who criticizes atheism of basically trying to convert them.
Oh boy, here we go.
Right. And at Light of Reflection points out what they see as a double standard. They say atheists often critique religious beliefs, but the minute someone challenges their beliefs,
It's suddenly off limits.
yeah, like how dare you question my lack of belief?
Haha. Right.
And at Light of Reflection also brings up the idea that young people in particular might be swayed by atheistic arguments, especially those that aren't well thought out.
It sounds like they're concerned about the future generation.
Yeah. And,
Where does the conversation go from there?
well, in a day that makes the claim that all religions are man-made.
Oh,
Like they're
wow.
just inventions created by humans to explain things they don't understand.
That's a common argument. How does At Light of Reflection respond to that?
They don't let that one slide either.
Of course not.
They basically challenge it, David, to back up that claim with evidence.
What kind of evidence?
Well, they bring up the fact that similar monotheistic beliefs have popped up in different cultures throughout history.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point.
They're basically saying, how do you explain that?
Yeah.
If religion is just a human invention, wouldn't you expect it to be more diverse and culturally specific?
That's a pretty compelling counterpoint.
And then they go on to talk about the impact religion has had on the world
Yeah.
compared to, well, in their view, the lack of significant contributions from atheism.
Okay, yeah, I'm following.
And then they made this interesting distinction between what they see as a divinely protected message.
Like the core teachings of their own faith.
Right. And all the other religions out there that might have gotten kind of distorted or manipulated by people over time.
So they acknowledge that there might be some human interference in how religion has played out historically.
Exactly. It's not just a black and white issue for them. Now, one final observation from At Light of Reflection, and this one really struck me as insightful.
Oh, tell me more.
They noticed that a lot of times atheists seem really angry in online debates.
I've seen that too.
And they pose this really interesting question. If God doesn't exist and religion is all just made up, then why would atheists be so passionate about discrediting it?
Why would it matter so much if they didn't believe in it?
Right. You'd think they'd just shrug it off and move on with their lives.
Yeah, like whatever. You believe what you want, I'll believe what I want.
Exactly. But it seems like there's often this real intensity there, this need to convince others that they're wrong.
So, At Light of Reflection is basically implying that maybe, deep down, some atheists are grappling with the idea of a godless universe.
Yeah, like maybe they're not as certain as they claim to be.
Interesting. How does the conversation end?
Well, At Light of Reflection ends with this final challenge. They say, if atheism is so fulfilling, then why the need to convince everyone else that life is random and meaningless?
Whoa, okay. That's a pretty heavy question to leave hanging in the air.
Yeah. And I think it's one that each of us has to grapple with on our own.
For sure.
So from the role of prayer
Yeah.
and the implications of a godless world to the debate about proselytizing and the real passion behind these arguments,
Yeah.
we've seen that this discussion about atheism and belief goes way deeper than just surface-level argument.
Absolutely. It raises all sorts of questions about what it means to be human, what we value, and what we believe in.
Root kind of sets the scene by saying, nature doesn't care about your beliefs. He points to things like typhoons and earthquakes that cause so much suffering, regardless of anyone's faith.
Yeah, he's going straight for that idea of nature's indifference, right? Like, if a tsunami wipes out a whole village, it doesn't matter if you're a saint or a sinner, it just happens. And Merck uses this to suggest that maybe there isn't some benevolent force out there watching over us, because if there was, wouldn't things be, well, a little less chaotic?
It's definitely something to think about.
Hmm.
But then Light of Reflection comes back with this really interesting point. He says, even in those moments of crisis, when everything feels like it's falling apart, people instinctively reach out to a higher power. It's almost like a reflex.
Right, like when you stub your toe, you say ouch without even thinking about it. It's that deep, he's saying. And he uses examples from religious texts, like the Quran, which specifically talk about finding strength and guidance during hardship.
Oh, and he also brings up this amazing story about Howard Storm, the guy who was a total skeptic until he had this near-death experience that completely changed his whole worldview.
Yeah, it's a powerful example, right? Because it suggests that maybe this urge to pray, this need to connect with something bigger than ourselves when things get tough, it might actually be hardwired into us, whether we realize it or not.
It's really fascinating. So basically, Light of Reflection is suggesting that this instinct to reach out, it transcends individual belief systems. It's something deeper, more primal.
Exactly. And it raises such an interesting question for everyone listening. Have you ever felt that pull, that need to reach out to something beyond yourself in a moment of crisis, even if you don't normally consider yourself religious? It's a pretty powerful thought, isn't it?
It really is. And this leads us right into the next big point of contention. Does prayer actually do anything? Merck, of course, sticks to his skeptical guns, arguing that praying can't stop a typhoon, which, fair enough. He sees it as human vanity to think we can influence these massive natural events just by, like, wishing them away or appealing to a higher being.
Yeah, it's hard to argue with that on a purely practical level. But then later reflection hits back with this really interesting counterpoint. He says, well, neither can science or atheism. It's like he's saying just because we haven't figured out how to scientifically measure or control something doesn't mean it doesn't exist or have power.
It's a good point. He's basically saying you can't demand empirical proof for something that by its very nature might operate outside the realm of what we can observe and measure.
Right. And he goes on to ask, why do people instinctively pray in those desperate moments if it's truly pointless? Like, what's driving that impulse, that deep-seated need to reach out, if not some innate connection to something beyond ourselves?
Yeah, it's not like people are thinking, well, this prayer isn't going to do anything, but I might as well try it anyway. There's something deeper going on there.
Yeah.
He even challenges Muck to prove that prayer doesn't work, which I thought was pretty bold.
Yeah, it really highlights the fundamental difference in their approaches. Muck is all about what we can see, touch, and measure, that tangible, empirical evidence. Light of reflection, on the other hand, is focused on inner experience, on those aspects of human existence that defy easy quantification.
So we've got nature's indifference on one side and this seemingly universal human impulse to pray on the other. It's a fascinating clash of perspectives, and honestly, we're just scratching the surface here. Comparing prayer to an animal's distress call. Like, it's just instinct, not necessarily a sign that there's some divine being listening, right?
It is a pretty interesting comparison when you think about it. He's basically saying when a cat, like, hisses at a threat, it's not praying to a cat god, it's just reacting to danger. So maybe, Mark argues, human prayer, even when it's super complex and ritualistic, is just a more evolved version of that same instinct, a way of dealing with all the scary, uncertain stuff life throws at us.
So is he saying that religion is just a fancy coping mechanism? That's a pretty bold statement.
It is bold, but then later reflection fires back with this great counter-argument. He's like, well, hold on a second. No animal built a civilization based on a hiss or a bark. He's saying that prayer has been this driving force behind some of the most significant things humans have accomplished. Shaping laws, ethics, entire societies. You can't just dismiss it as a simple animal instinct.
You can't deny that religion has had a huge impact on human history, that's for sure. Good, bad, and everything in between.
Totally. And what I find really interesting is how Light of Reflection uses Mark's own argument against him. He points out that even science and atheism, the very things Mark uses to critique religion, are also products of culture and history.
Ah, I see what he did there. So no belief system exists in a vacuum. We're all influenced by the time and place we live in.
Exactly. It's all connected. He even brings up specific examples where prayers seem to influence events in a way that's hard to explain as just coincidence,
So maybe there's more to it than just wishful thinking. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Like, how do we even form our own beliefs? Is anything we believe really objective, or are we all just shaped by our upbringing and the people around us?
Right. Like, where do our ideas come from? It's a huge philosophical question, but it's worth thinking about. Anyway, all of this leads to another really interesting part of their debate. Remember how Mark was all about demanding empirical proof that prayer changes outcomes? Well, Light of Reflection dives into the real purpose of prayer, saying it's not about getting what you want, like some cosmic vending machine.
So no praying for a winning lottery ticket or a perfect parking spot then. So what is it about?
Well, he explains that prayer, at its core, is about acknowledging that we're not in total control. It's about recognizing a higher power and surrendering to a greater will, whatever that means for us individually. Whether we survive a tough situation or, return to our Creator, for those who believe, it's about finding peace and acceptance in that surrender, whatever the outcome may be.
Okay, I'm starting to see the difference here. So it's not about dictating the outcome. It's about finding meaning and connection in the process.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And Light of Reflection contrasts this with atheism, which he sees as leading to a kind of randomness and lack of ultimate meaning. Like, if there's no higher power, everything just happens by chance. There's no ultimate justice, no ultimate purpose. He really goes there, even challenging those who don't believe to either prove God doesn't exist or escape death, which is kind of a heavy statement.
Whoa, he's not pulling any punches.
He's not. And it really highlights this core difference in how these two worldviews see suffering. One offers comfort and meaning, even in the face of tragedy, while the other just sees it as a random event with no greater significance. Pretty intense stuff.
It is. And then things take another turn. Mark shifts the conversation to the idea of whether all these different religions are actually valid. He uses examples like, conflicts in the Middle East to show how religious beliefs can divide people and lead to violence.
It's a valid point. I mean, history is full of examples of wars and oppression that were all driven by religious beliefs. But, and this might surprise you, Light of Reflection actually agrees with him on this one.
He does. Wait, I thought they were on completely opposite sides here.
They are, but Light of Reflection admits that many religions today have been corrupted by, let's say, less than noble leaders who twisted those original teachings to gain power and control. It's like they created these counterfeit versions of the real deal.
So like fake money. Just because there are counterfeits out there doesn't mean real money doesn't exist. You just have to be careful about what you're accepting as genuine.
Precisely. And then he goes on to outline what he sees as the criteria for a true, authentic religion. An unbroken chain of transmission from the original source, scriptures that haven't been tampered with, prophets who performed miracles, and a line of, let's call them, guardians, who were divinely appointed to preserve those teachings. He claims that Islam, with its concept of a divinely guided lineage protecting the Quran's meaning, fits that bill.
It's almost like a checklist for evaluating religious authenticity. It makes you think about how we all decide what we believe is true. What are our standards? And where do they come from? Are they truly objective, or are they also influenced by our own cultural biases?
Right. These are some deep questions, and we could probably spend a whole other deep dive just unpacking them. But it looks like we're about to get to the heart of the debate between atheism and belief, and things are about to get even more intense. No holding back in this round, that's for sure. Merck comes right out and says praying to a deity that doesn't exist is pointless. And he goes on to call out what he sees as attacks on atheists, saying it's basically just proselytizing, like trying to force those beliefs on people who don't buy into them. His stance is clear. All religions, nothing more than man-made ideas, period.
So to him, if there's no God, all that praying and religious stuff is just a waste of time, right?
Yeah.
And like talking to a wall.
Exactly. But Light of Reflection isn't letting that slide. He jumps in, accuses Merck of circular reasoning, like saying God doesn't exist because there's no evidence, but that doesn't really prove anything, does it?
No, not really. It's like saying I don't have a car because I don't have a car. Doesn't get you anywhere.
You got it. Light of Reflection is basically saying, hey, if you're going to make that claim, you need some solid evidence to back it up. He's pushing for a deeper level of intellectual honesty in this debate.
And he doesn't stop there either. Light of Reflection takes it further, arguing that without God, morality becomes all wishy-washy. Like what's right and wrong becomes just personal preference. And life, no real purpose. And justice, forget about it. It's all just power plays with no ultimate right or wrong.
He also brings up this thing that a lot of people feel strongly about. Atheists can critique religion all day long, but as soon as someone religious pushes back, boom, it's labeled as forcing your beliefs on others.
Yeah, that's a tricky one for sure. Where's the line between open discussion and pushing your own agenda? It's something to think about no matter what you believe.
Absolutely. And then Light of Reflection adds this really interesting observation to the mix. He points out that prophets in totally different parts of the world, different times, different cultures, somehow ended up with these strikingly similar messages about one God and living a moral life.
That's kind of wild when you think about it. Like all these different groups, but they arrive at these core beliefs that have so much in common.
Right. It makes you wonder if maybe those shared values point to some kind of universal truth that goes beyond culture and history. It's a mind-blowing idea.
Definitely makes you think. To wrap it all up, Light of Reflection throws out a few parting shots, questions aimed at Mark, but also at everyone listening, really. He's like, why are atheists so determined to discredit something they claim doesn't even matter? And can you really find fulfillment in a worldview where everything, life, intelligence, our very existence is just random chance? Heavy stuff.
Those are some deep questions to wrestle with. He's basically asking us to really examine the core of both atheism and belief. How do these different perspectives shape how we see ourselves and the world around us?